Whether you are concerned about your health or that of your patients and are looking for different ways to help, you have surely heard about microbiota, its relationship with almost all aspects of our health, and the various approaches proposed to address it. But it is undoubtedly a complex issue, and it is necessary to have useful and updated information that allows us to make the best decisions. We are fortunate to have a great expert, Dr. La Rosa, to talk about this today. Welcome, Doctor.
Thank you very much, Alfredo, for the invitation. It is always a good idea to understand how flora impacts our lives, because more and more, the information and scientific evidence we find speaks of greater effects on our health.
Magnificent. Well, perhaps the first question, Dr. La Rosa, would be at what point we are in general regarding the flora. Have we lost something compared to previous generations? What is our flora like in today's society?
The first concept that needs to be understood here, which I find essential, is that all the information we have about flora, and I'm talking about more than 90% of the information we have on bacterial flora, is less than 10 years old. And this is extremely important. Why? Because the evidence is new, because the information is new, or because we are beginning to understand we are still in the early stages of our knowledge of the flora. But unfortunately, we do know that in recent decades we have lost a significant amount of bacterial diversity, a diversity of microorganisms that reside within us, which perform functions that we do not yet fully understand, resulting in the loss of 90% of the genetic information of this bacterial flora. This means that by losing diversity, we have lost part of its DNA, and obviously we do not even comprehend the vastness of the effects this has on our body and our long-term health. This has many causes. It has dietary causes, lifestyle-related causes, causes related to chemicals that enter our bodies that shouldn't, and many other options that we will explore in this video.
Perfect. The truth is that it's a number that is shocking, a 90% loss. What consequences could it have? Because we are also seeing a rise, for example, in certain pathologies. We are observing an increasing incidence of allergies and digestive disorders that have yet to find a solution.
It may be related, it is obviously related, but we do not know to what extent, and we do not fully understand the impact it has on the complexity of the interaction we have between the bacteria inside us and our own, for example, our own digestive system, our own immune system. We know that the interaction exists. We know that it has an interaction not only with those systems, but also with our nervous system, and to understand its entirety. Obviously, the information we currently have is not enough, but we know that this loss of bacterial diversity, this loss of bacterial DNA in recent decades has an impact on our immune system, has an impact on the emergence of allergies, has an impact on, for example, our mood, as we will see, has an impact on our metabolic and cardiovascular health, and obviously has an impact on our nervous system. And this is more than anything important, especially due to the balance we have related between the nervous system and our digestive functioning. And that Alfredo has logically seen a very, very significant increase in the occurrence of digestive disorders that are not entirely clear.
Indeed, because that point is very relevant. Surely many of the people watching us now, or many of the health professionals attending to, different patients have encountered cases of digestive problems. Various tests are conducted on the patients. Everything seems fine, but the disorder continues. The patient keeps reporting issues, and there comes a time when we don't know how to address it. The specialists conclude that there is nothing evident. What could we do?
The first thing to understand here is that bacterial flora and the functioning of our digestive system are closely linked, and this obviously increases the chance of developing certain conditions that we now call functional. Why is it called that? What needs to be understood here is what happened to all of us during medical school. We were studying conditions like irritable bowel syndrome, for example, and we found that they were diseases of exclusion. They were diseases that, in order to diagnose correctly, we first had to ensure that there was no other disease that justified their symptoms. So, there was a patient who had an endoscopy, a video colonoscopy, and did not have any lesions, for example, in their intestinal mucosa. Or perhaps we had a video capsule and we had the entire digestive tract photographed. And despite that, we did not see any justification for a functional disorder that leads to digestive problems. Well, that is precisely where conditions arise that are not related to a specific injury, but rather to something that is not functioning properly. Either I do not produce enough acidity in my stomach to properly digest food, or I have an overgrowth of bacteria in my small intestine that should not have developed excessively in the first place, which causes me significant symptomatic episodes. Either I have disorders of the bacterial flora where any food makes me feel unwell, or I start to develop digestive allergies. And these accumulations of symptoms do not have a very, very defined cause. In reality, they are the consequence of a multiplicity of situations or events that should not have occurred. Firstly, alterations in bacterial flora such as changes in our enzymatic production or our own immune system, lead to conditions that unfortunately most people suffering from them experience over time and cannot resolve because they do not understand their underlying cause.
A true mystery many times. A nearly detective-like task, if we had to identify in this whole picture. We have talked about, for example, problems. With pH, we have talked about SIBO, we have talked about flora, we have talked about enzymatic issues. If we had to establish a timeline to go to the trigger, it exists. We know it is different for each person, for each patient, but is there a common thread? Is there a usual trigger?
There are several common threads or triggers. There is not just one, obviously, because each of us is very different. But the important concept here is that there is undoubtedly a trigger, which is the loss of bacterial diversity. If we have groups of hunter-gatherers who still maintain a very Paleolithic lifestyle in some way, they have a greater bacterial diversity, which means that they have a higher quantity of bacteria within their bodies, within their digestive systems. This is important because when we compare them to people who follow a modern diet, we find that there is a huge amount of bacterial diversity in these communities, such as the Hadza, which has already been lost by people living a modern lifestyle. And this diversity is closely associated with pathologies. Why? Because the greater the bacterial diversity we have, the easier it is for all those bacterial groups to remain in balance, preventing the excessive development of a group of bacteria that we do not want, and ensuring that we do not lack a group of bacteria that plays a positive role in our health. So this diversity helps us maintain a balance of flora that is extremely important, and we don't even know today how important it is because we don't have all the necessary information. That is the point one without a doubt. The point two relates to the consumption of substances that harm our bacterial flora. The consumption of substances such as refined foods, foods high in sugars or glycemic index, and certain inflammatory products, especially those resulting from the cooking of vegetable oils and other inflammatory products, ultimately harms beneficial bacterial flora. However, they also stimulate a bacterial flora that we will discuss later, along with how these impact our health, which in turn causes significant long-term damage not only to the digestive system, but also to the nervous system. So, diversity is interesting. On one hand, poor nutrition is interesting because it not only damages that diversity, but also the groups of bacteria that we already have in our bodies. And also, obviously, at the level of nutrition. We not only have to avoid foods that are harmful to the bacterial flora we want, but also nourish the bacterial flora that we do want to develop, providing it with what it needs in some way. Most of these bacteria consume a type of soluble fiber, basically made of sugars, that we as humans cannot digest, but these bacteria can. They are essentially water-soluble fibers. The classic example is inulin, but we also have fructooligosaccharides. And some resistant starches, which are all raw materials that beneficial bacteria need to develop in the body and produce substances that we will see are extremely beneficial, including neurotransmitters that improve our mood, vitamins, and ketone bodies that help us use fat as an energy source, among many different options. But on one hand, we have diversity. On the other, we have nutrition, both what harms us and what the bacteria effectively need. Obviously, the use of antibiotics can damage the bacterial diversity, which has its pros and cons. It does not mean that one should never use them, but it is important to understand that they have an impact on bacterial diversity. This is because a broad-spectrum antibiotic can easily harm the bacteria present in my digestive system, leading to a loss of bacterial diversity. But these are three very, very basic areas. There are many more. On one hand, we know that a sedentary lifestyle helps us lose diversity. It effectively leads to an increase in bacteria that we do not want and decreases the development of beneficial bacteria. This happens especially when our Vomax decreases, which we know from relatively recent info. We know, for example, that this exercise-associated bacterial flora is central to keeping the brain young for most of life. So there are many different interactions between factors related to habits, sleep quality, for example. We know that the increase in cortisol, the stress hormone related to sleep loss, can decrease the bacterial diversity that we have and lead to these damages that begin only in bacteria. Next, we have the world of our digestive system, where high levels of stress, for example, or poor nutrition can reduce our stomach's ability to fully digest proteins. And this is extremely important because many of the negative consequences of bacterial flora are actually associated with that protein fermentation afterwards. But on one hand, we have stomach acid, which will be central, and on the other hand, our enzymatic capacity, where we also have substances called enzymes that help us digest the foods we consume. We have enzymes for carbohydrates, we have enzymes for fats, we have enzymes for proteins, which are central because they often accelerate the process. Digestion will happen the same way, but if I have enough enzymes, my digestion will be much faster, because enzymes accelerate a chemical process by hundreds of times. So, if I have slow digestion, a basic premise I need to consider is my digestive system before thinking about bacterial flora. Is it functioning properly and producing the substances it needs? Releasing at the pancreatic level, for example, the enzymes I need to digest food. And obviously, if I don't do it, I will start to see these functional pathologies, these functional alterations of the digestive system, where we see, for example, a difficulty in properly digesting proteins, which then ends up damaging my colonic bacterial flora, A. Difficulty in digesting fats, A. Difficulty in digesting carbohydrates, which ultimately leads to the growth of bacteria that I do not want in my body and also results in a greater accumulation of fat. And obviously, all these disorders lead to an accumulation of symptoms that can include slow digestion, abdominal distension, fluctuations between diarrhea and constipation, or issues with intestinal motility, many negative symptoms that broadly affect our quality of life, not just at a digestive level. They can also cause difficulties in concentrating, lead to mental fog, and in more serious inflammatory cases, increase the chances of developing autoimmune diseases, among other issues.
Indeed. We have talked about the loss of bacterial diversity, which may be related, as we mentioned, to moving away from the way of life we have led for so many thousands of years, not only in terms of nutrition, of course, but also in terms of physical activity that excess cortisol. We talk about good and bad nutrition. And I found it very interesting, Dr. La Rosa, the sequence in which you identified various problems at the digestive system level that can in turn affect the flora. And I understand that again, in return, they could affect our digestive system once more. Are the digestive system and bacterial flora really related? It would be necessary to consider that if we want to start some type of intervention, we should begin with these two approaches. Yes, without a doubt.
There is a basic problem that we have with bacterial flora, and it needs to be understood this way. If you know nothing about bacterial flora, it doesn't matter, because this information will still help you understand the logic behind trying to repair a bacterial flora that has lost diversity, in which we have an overgrowth of bacteria, parasites, or fungi that we do not want. And we need to try to recover all these processes that we somehow disrupted and that altered homeostasis, changed our balance, which is that our bacterial flora needs equilibrium. To maintain that balance, we need to uphold certain habits, a specific type of diet, a certain kind of movement, and a particular circadian cycle. We cannot, for example, stay awake all night and then expect to have no biological consequences in our body. So it requires us to do certain things. And why is this important? Because we can try to recover, for example, some beneficial bacteria for our body by taking supplements like probiotics, which are now very well known. What is the problem with this? If I do not repair the underlying mechanism by which I am losing bacterial diversity, it is an infinite game. It is a game where I will always need probiotics to try to compensate for the damage I am doing to my digestive system and my bacterial flora. What is the mistake here? The first mistake is that the supplements we have available today do not contain the necessary amount of bacteria to compensate for the damage we have been causing. Why? Because all these communities that have a much more traditional lifestyle with a greater diversity of bacteria have tens to hundreds of times more bacteria than you. We are talking about people who have hundreds of different bacteria to thousands of different bacteria. And why is this extremely important? Because I cannot recover those thousands of bacteria with a supplement that has 10, 15, or 20 different types of bacteria, because we do not have the necessary substances to take it as a supplement. So unfortunately, we need to change these habits. In order to change these habits, what we need to understand is that a one-size-fits-all approach does not work for everyone. Someone who has a problem digesting vegetables, for example, does not need the same advice and the same probiotic supplements as someone who has a problem digesting proteins. They are completely different because the balances of different families of bacterial flora that we have in our bodies are altered and are not the same as each other. We have bacteria, on one hand, that feed on soluble fiber and help us, for example, to stay active, to maintain a stable energy level throughout the day, and to burn fat. And we know that these bacteria feed on soluble fiber, and we know that one of the famous substances they produce is butyrate, which is a substance from which we can extract energy as a reserve and is very similar to the ketone bodies in our body. So it is interesting to understand that each family of bacteria requires me to do something different to replenish it. On one hand, for example, when we have disorders in protein digestion, we start to have bacteria We begin to increase bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide, which produce inflammatory substances such as lipopolysaccharides, which produce use and substances derived from ammonia. So all of this entire balance of bacterial flora somehow has to be compensated, but according to the problem that I have. Why? Because these bacteria, which are, for example, producers of all these substances like hydrogen sulfide, will be harmful if I do not repair my protein digestion. And the solution is not to take a supplement, it is to understand that each of these functional groups of bacteria, those that produce vitamins, those that produce hydrogen sulfide, those that produce ammonia-derived substances, those that produce butyrate, etc., they need a different measure for me to repair them. Because some require soluble fiber and others, like these derivatives, feed on undigested proteins, which means I need to repair my protein digestion. What they need is for food that shouldn't have arrived in the first place not to reach them because I have a digestive problem.
In the end, of course, many times the recommendation or what we think of first is prebiotics and probiotics, but it is clearly insufficient compared to the approach you mentioned regarding bacterial families. So, how could we imagine this? There are different degrees, as always, of approach, different complexities, different patients. But if the starting point is the loss of bacterial diversity, would there be some more or less common initial approach that could be conveyed to the patient to start taking care of their microbiota and digestive system?
Without a doubt, we will divide it into levels to make it practical for those who are seeing this for the first time in some way. At level 1, it undoubtedly has to do with nutrition. It does not involve using any type of supplement, any type of substance, or any type of analysis. One level of complexity relates to, on one hand, increasing the variety of foods that we should consume, including organic vegetables and fruits, pasture-raised animals, and also trying to eat organ meats. This type of diversity helps me maintain greater bacterial diversity, obviously avoiding industrialized foods, refined sugar foods, and pro-inflammatory foods. But if I stick to these more classic types of pyramids, within what we know, we should all consume some seeds and nuts, as well as animals, eggs, fish, seafood, and organ meats. Why do I insist so much on offal? Because they naturally have a balance of amino acids that is less repetitive. Why is this very interesting? Because if I constantly eat the muscle of the animal, the pattern of amino acids that I will receive is constant, because I am always breaking down the same types of proteins. In contrast, when I consume organ meats, for example, I have different tissues and the diversity of amino acids that I consume is different. It is obviously greater. And this is important because many times increasing a specific type of amino acid but not the others hinders the proper absorption and digestion of these amino acids. It is the first interesting point within what is an easy level to change and try not to need any substances that we know harm the bacterial flora, such as non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs like ibuprofen and obviously antibiotics. Level 2 has to do with starting to understand that we, 2009, will not be able to compensate for the bacterial flora disorders we have and the loss of bacterial diversity we experience, at least for most of us, due to the simple fact that the foods we consume come from soils that have already lost bacterial flora. Naturally, when I use pesticides and the quantity or diversity of soil bacteria decreases, unfortunately, what I'm doing is reducing the availability of many nutrients for the plant as well. So it is very interesting why. Because this decrease in the variety of bacteria that we have in the soil leads to a decrease in nutrients in the food that I will later consume and an increased chance of developing nutritional deficiencies afterwards. That is why there is so much discussion today about regenerative agriculture, agroforestry, and permaculture, which aim to repair these phenomena by increasing bacterial diversity. And that is a very interesting process because it doesn't require me to do anything special. I just have to consume the same foods I would have consumed otherwise. Only what changes here are the sources, how the food was prepared, in what soil it was grown, etc. And it is something very simple to carry out. What I can do together at this level 2, in addition to that diet, is to start consuming fermented foods, which I know incorporate bacteria, including few bacterial types, mainly lactobacilli, which are the ones that grow when we ferment, for example, dairy products. So, by consuming kefir, Greek yogurt, various types of fermented drinks and foods, kimchi, and natto, which I particularly enjoy, I gain greater bacterial diversity and a higher quantity of bacteria because fermented foods are rich in those very bacteria. It is useless for me to go look for a fermented food that is then pasteurized because I lose those bacteria. 2009, that is level 2. A level 3 already incorporates, it does all of this, but it includes some type of supplements, incorporating these soluble fibers in the form of supplements, as I mentioned before, which help ensure that the food the bacteria need reaches them in sufficient quantities. On one hand, the most classic is inulin, but we also have psyllium husk, fructooligosaccharides, and cyr oligosaccharides. These are all different types of soluble fiber. Surprisingly, and this is a very high level of complexity, each type of soluble fiber serves different types of bacteria. Inulin is not beneficial for all the bacteria in our digestive system, so that is the first step we can take. The second step, obviously, is to incorporate the intake of probiotic supplements that already contain a large amount of bacterial diversity, about 20 bacterial strains, for example, which help me maintain this diversity. If I don't do everything right, if I do things wrong, and I know that I make mistakes regarding my diet, I make mistakes regarding medications that I absolutely need to use because I have certain health problems, etc. It is very interesting to at least compensate for the damage with these two types of supplements. Probiotic supplements, where I know I maintain that bacterial diversity, and prebiotic supplements, where I know I help beneficial bacteria not to die and to thrive even more. The level of complexity for me is greater when it comes to studying bacterial flora. Alfredo, there is a reality that each one of us is different, and the most reasonable method to understand what I need is to study my bacterial flora. This involves taking a sample of my feces, genetically sequencing my bacteria, and understanding based on this what bacterial groups I have developed more of and which bacterial groups I have developed less of. Why is this important? Because this will help me deal with all the symptoms related to, for example, intolerances to certain foods, which may be related to your bacterial flora, and the fact that your bacterial flora is not prepared to digest that amount of foods from that specific group, and that is why you are experiencing these symptoms. Therefore, repairing and maintaining that flora in balance is very beneficial and obviously requires the preparation of supplements such as probiotics, personalized according to Sebastian's fecal matter, identifying which bacteria he needs, and preparing the specific supplement to compensate for that damage. That is the highest level, if you will, in terms of supplementation specifically designed for an individual, aiming to repair only the bacterial flora. We haven't even delved into what has to do with the digestive system, the functioning of the digestive system. But this vicious circle you mentioned at the beginning occurs if I have damage to my bacterial flora and cannot properly digest food. Obviously, I will present digestive symptoms, and over time, these digestive symptoms will create that vicious circle where they further damage my bacterial flora.
Magnificent, magnificent proposal. In 4 points, I remember. On one hand, start with this diet that has greater variability, trying to ensure it is of organic farming quality. On the other hand, it is not only about diet, but also about introducing fermented foods that can directly provide more of the bacteria we need. On a third level, turn to supplements starting with fiber, which is what our bacteria need, the soluble fibers, and then also turn to probiotics. Finally, that personalized genetic study of our bacteria would allow for the customization, for example, of supplementation. Some questions regarding this, Dr. La Rosa. The topic of increasing the variability of our diet, we have talked about fruits and vegetables, fundamentally discussing, for example, the colors on the plate. What would be the objective? To introduce as many foods as possible? To introduce as many colors as possible? Would it be indifferent to focus more on vegetables than on fruits?
Well, here the concept at the level of nutrition is important for 2 or 3 different reasons. In reality, the concept of colors relates to a concentration of nutrients, which is a somewhat simplistic explanation that serves the general public when they do not specifically know about nutrition. But let's move on to something a bit more complex. Let's give this concept a bit more of a twist. Diversity is related to ensuring that I am not consuming too much of one nutrient or lacking another nutrient. Diversity in food simply means that as long as I stick to a list of sensible foods, we are not talking about consuming ultra-processed foods. Diversity helps mitigate the risk of nutritional deficiencies. This is the first concept that needs to be understood here. It is essential because all diets that are more restrictive in terms of options, if we want, we can think of raw veganism at one extreme and absolute carnivorism at the other, have a higher risk of nutritional deficiencies. The more restrictive the diets are, the further they are from the midpoint. The less animal products I consume, the greater the risk I have of deficiency in all the nutrients that come from animals. The less vegetables I consume, the greater the risk I have of deficiency in all the substances that we find in greater amounts in vegetables. Classic situation of a keto diet, a paleo diet, creating a deficit of magnesium and potassium, and the classic situation of a raw vegan diet, creating a deficiency in vitamin D, a deficiency in B, or a deficiency in carnitine, which we will discuss later if we have time. So the concept here is to understand the very simple situation of saying that diversity means less risk of nutritional deficiencies and greater ease in maintaining bacterial diversity as well. And there are 2 or 3 caveats that I am interested in making regarding this matter of the diet you mentioned about vegetables. The first point is that today's fruits have been modified over generations to have an increasing fructose content and a decreasing fiber content. This has a negative impact on our bacterial flora, which despite the modifications in fruit, still requires the same type of food and the same types of substances in terms of bioavailability. What does this mean? It means that if I eat an orange today, or if I eat a banana today, the amount of sugar that reaches my digestive system is very high, especially if I consume it as juice, directly eliminating the fiber. This has a generally negative impact on my bacterial flora, negatively affecting hormones like insulin because the blood sugar spike is very high. Obviously, it is less severe than any industrialized food that already contains refined sugars, but it is still a negative impact on the bacterial flora. And the third concept is that these rules we mentioned apply to everyone, except in situations where we have SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. If I start consuming fermented foods, I will suddenly become even more bloated and will present more symptoms, and the solution goes in a different direction. And then in scenarios where we have, for example, food consumption, which we can test with those genetic analyses I mentioned earlier about bacterial flora, what is done is no longer growing a bacterium on a petri dish as we used to do in microbiology, but rather analyzing the genetic sequence to identify it. And based on that sequence, it is known whether it is lactobacillus such, and such, etc. So, that sequencing also allows me to identify if I have viruses in the foods that I consume. And this is important because I can consume cucumber or tomato thinking that it is fabulous, believing that it has a great impact without having any digestive problems, but incorporating a virus, for example, called mosaic virus, which can cause an alteration in the bacteria that we have in our digestive system. So, the levels of complexity are infinite. Don't worry if you don't understand this. The concept is that food diversity is useful to me, and there are small situations where it can negatively impact me. Does this mean I have to go out and not eat cucumber, not eat tomato? No, because the virus from one plant can really be in any plant. Just as humans have viruses, plants have viruses, and obviously this impacts the bacteria that can develop or not. Next, the concept is food diversity, trying to maintain a low glycemic index. This means not drinking fruit juice, or ideally eating the fruit with its own fiber, or trying to consume fruits that have a lower glycemic index, such as red fruits, for example, forest fruits, and not so much the fruits with a higher glycemic index. Those are the attempts we can make at the level of nutrition, clarifying these points. And then regarding nutrients and colors, I would say it's more about understanding what nutritional deficiencies I am at risk of and thinking about it from that perspective.
I fully understand the objective and the need regarding the variability of diet in terms of fermented foods. Yes, I also find it interesting, Doctor, what you mentioned about SIBO, because it is true that there is now a rise in the consumption of fermented foods such as kombucha, kefir, and all kinds. I would like to briefly discuss, if possible, what negative effects it could have on certain types of people, for example, those who suffer from SIBO, and also what would be the appropriate way to consume it. Is it enough to consume a small amount of fermented foods daily? Is it preferable to space it out over time? Are there any general recommendations?
Well, the general recommendation is always to consume a small amount of each type of fermented food and different kinds because each one provides me with different types of bacteria. So I don't have to drink 1 liter of kefir every day. What I need to do is provide bacterial variety. I can provide it in fruit form as a supplement by taking a probiotic capsule, or I can provide it in the form of these fermented foods. Unfortunately, those fermented foods do not bring hundreds of bacteria. At most, they bring 8 or 9 types of bacteria that develop in those cultures, and generally even fewer. So, whenever I consume large amounts of a fermented food and stick to just one, I risk increasing that specific bacterial group and keeping it out of balance with the others, which always has a negative impact, because beneficial bacteria are beneficial because I generally have them in lower amounts and I want to stimulate them. It's not about stimulating them forever. If I stimulate them and they grow too much, even positive bacteria could end up having a negative impact on my health. What happens is that, in very general terms, this does not occur in 99% of the population. We find ourselves in the opposite situation. That is why these general recommendations include the incorporation of fermented foods. In what situation is it not appropriate to include fermented foods? Obviously, in situations where I have an overgrowth of those bacterial groups, I realize that this is happening because I consume that food and experience digestive problems. I have negative digestive symptoms. Then I have bloating, I have pain, I have more inflammation, etc. And they are caused by the overdevelopment of a specific group of bacteria that disrupts the balance of those different types of bacterial families. That is the person who should not consume it, the person who symptomatically realizes that they are experiencing harm, a negative symptom after consuming it. Unfortunately, it is very common today for people who are unaware of this information to consume too many fermented foods, thinking that it is something they have to go through, meaning, I have to nourish my bacterial flora. Is it normal to go through this process? No, that's incorrect. What needs to be understood is which bacteria should be developed more and which bacteria should be naturally reduced. In terms of fermented foods, this implies consuming a variety of fermented foods and, if possible, obviously conducting a bacterial flora analysis to understand which bacteria need to be further developed.
Very good recommendation. And everything points to the same thing, which is balance. The moment we become unbalanced in one direction or even the other, we can encounter problems. As we mentioned a little while ago, that can affect practically all areas of our life. So, considering those health professionals who have clinical practice in different specialties, it doesn't matter whether we are talking about psychologists, the locomotor system, or the digestive system. Practically, any professional who engages in clinical practice can benefit their patients' outcomes and health through microbiota. What specific cases or in which specific areas is this more evident?
Look, there is a lot of new information regarding these things, from understanding that today muscles not only serve a locomotor role, but also understanding them from an endocrine perspective. For example, I was going to do neurosurgery before I decided to dive into this type of medicine, like functional medicine, and I found that while studying, we considered that the testicle or the brain, for instance, were immunological sanctuaries where we normally did not have any type of bacteria. And today we have more and more autopsies showing that there are bacteria inside our nervous system functioning under correct conditions, in conditions of normal flora. There is a lack of verification for this evidence, but it is very interesting because in the coming years we will have something very clear that we may recognize as a bacterial flora in the brain specifically, playing a role and making this interaction that we know as the gut-brain connection. So, the first concept we need to understand is that the information is new, the information is changing, and the information grows every year. In this case, literally every year. So, what we need to understand here is what information we have today that we know can contribute clinically to improving someone's quality of life. Without a doubt, the first area we need to consider regarding the bacterial flora, in my opinion, is the one related to the interaction with the nervous system and mood. We know that there is this colloquial thing of calling the digestive system the second brain due to the interrelation that exists between the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems and the digestive system. If you want to call it that, go ahead. There's no problem. The criterion is the existing relationship. And what does this mean? It means, first of all, that the bacteria in our digestive system can produce up to 90% of neurotransmitters like serotonin. Why is this important? Because the serotonin that we produce is necessary to compensate for the excessive stress levels that most of us are facing day by day. It doesn't matter if they are imaginary or real, but they help us maintain a balance between this level of nervous system excitement, a level of tranquility necessary for good sleep quality, for good digestion, and above all, for a healthy sexual desire as well. So, these three things are being lost nowadays. The amount of sexual desire in people is decreasing, sexual activity in people is decreasing, and the quality of sleep in people is decreasing, obviously for many reasons beyond just the digestive system. Many functional issues of the digestive system are emerging that seem to have no apparent cause, yet they obviously have this more hidden cause related to the functioning of the digestive system in terms of hypochlorhydria, enzyme production, bacterial flora, etc. So that is an aspect we know we can improve if we increase the amount of bacteria that produce serotonin, for example, like Bifidobacterium bifidum. So there are bacteria that we know produce these substances, which need the good nutrition we were talking about earlier in order to develop, and they require a good level of sleep and a low level of stress to survive. Because it is not just a matter of being able to develop it or taking it in the form of a supplement, but rather I am providing the necessary habitat conditions for those bacteria to remain stable over time. And since they can produce up to 90% of certain neurotransmitters, if I decrease my production in the brain and can compensate for it with the digestive system, I have a buffering mechanism that addresses These problems related to mood, and especially with a level of balance between mood and functioning, not only digestive but also throughout the day, night, sleep, etc. This is just one area that is related to mood. Obviously, there are more, and there are more related aspects, for example, with the immune system, where today we know that bacterial diversity is necessary for our immune system to become accustomed to these bacteria and not recognize them as threats, not responding to them as if they were bacteria contaminating a wound where I do need to respond. This distinction made by our immune system between friendly bacteria and harmful bacteria is essential. Why? Because it loosens. This issue, along with other problems such as intestinal permeability, which can also occur when we alter our gut flora, and when we disrupt the mucosa of the small intestine and large intestine, leads over time to increasingly serious problems ranging from allergies and sensitivity to a specific food to autoimmune issues that are on the rise today. One of the theoretical causes is this loss of bacterial diversity and this loss of the integrity of the intestinal mucosa. So we have, on one hand, very important areas for mood, and on the other hand, very important areas for the immune system. But what is most interesting to me, since my field today is longevity, is to understand what impact this bacterial flora has on the aging of different organs. And this is done, especially these studies are conducted on mice, but we know that a transplant of bacterial flora from a person or a younger mouse can generate very beneficial effects on aging, and in this case on rejuvenation. From tissues and organs of older mice, and we began to notice that these more representative bacteria of the bacterial flora of young mice start to produce substances called postbiotics. Everything that the substance produces, everything that my bacteria produce is postbiotic, and what they need to feed on is So I have the prebiotic, the probiotic, which are the bacteria that help me maintain a good flora, and the postbiotic, which are the substances produced by these good bacteria that help me slow down aging. Or at least that is the theory. We need to see if it transfers correctly from a mouse to a human, but we understand that, on the other hand, within this family of postbiotics, beyond their effect on longevity, we know that these substances help us maintain good levels of vitamin K, help us maintain good levels of serotonin, help us produce vitamin B, and help us produce, as I mentioned before, butyrate. So, there is a production of substances, small amounts of dopamine, and there is also a production of substances necessary for the proper functioning not only of our nervous system, but of our entire organism, which is beneficial and requires, of course, that I maintain that flora in balance. These are the most important areas that I would say one must take into account to explain why it matters to maintain a good bacterial flora and why it is important to keep it balanced. Moreover, it is essential to avoid these problems that unfortunately more and more people are experiencing, which are issues of digestive intolerances, abdominal distension problems, and digestive symptoms that seem to have no specific cause because there is no injury, for example, in any study, etc.
It really intervenes in everything. It intervenes in all areas of our life. And the virtuous circle that can be formed is also very interesting, right? Because as I understand it, the state of our gut flora will certainly influence various aspects. For example, in the greater capacity we have for stress management, which in turn will influence our ability to maintain a more appropriate balance within our gut microbiota. And in this way, they feed back into each other. I understand that the opposite also occurs.
In the opposite sense, it indeed happens. And something wonderful happens, Alfredo, which is that much of the clinical impact we have when we change our bacterial flora is actually discovered by mistake. We discover it in cases. I always mention the classic example of cases where diarrhea occurs after prolonged antibiotic use during hospitalization, where there is a loss of diversity in bacteria precisely due to those antibiotics, and a type of bacteria called Clostridium starts to grow excessively. Those diarrheas caused by Clostridium, which are typical of prolonged hospitalizations, for example, from very broad-spectrum antibiotics used for a long duration, end up leading to measures, if you will. Desperate attempts to try to repair them, such as the bacterial flora transplant 2009 at the time. So, the typical scenarios in these situations are very interesting. Why? Because we encounter a woman of menopausal age, in her 50s, going through this type of situation, who receives a fecal transplant from her daughter, who was much thinner than her. Over the months following that fecal transplant, the woman starts to lose weight, begins to lose body fat, without changing her habits, without increasing the amount of exercise she does, without decreasing the calories she consumes, and without changing her diet in any way. So we understand that there is an impact, at least a very significant metabolic one, that obviously affects our risk of diabetes, our risk of insulin resistance, which impacts the management of blood sugar in our body, and obviously affects the total amount of calories that we will absorb from food, ultimately leading to these phenomena. It leads to events that we do not yet know if they translate to humans, such as the rejuvenation of certain tissues in mice, and effects that do translate to humans because we have already seen them in people, like weight loss in individuals who are overweight because they changed their gut microbiota. This always reminds me of the stories of migratory birds, which, for example, in southern Germany, change their diet before migration to accumulate energy, to build up fat, to have reserves. By changing their diet, they quickly gain weight in fat due to the change in their gut microbiota, and then when they reach their destination in sub-Saharan Africa, they also lose that weight very quickly by returning to a diet consistent with what they originally had. Then they recover that bacterial flora and lose the fat they had not been able to completely shed during the migratory journey. It is very interesting because the metabolic effect is there. We do not know how important it is, and obviously today we do not have measures to offer a normal person a bacterial flora transplant. In a way, it remains a simplistic measure in which behavior should change your diet and repair the flora from within, so you wouldn't need transplanted flora. However, it is still a very interesting tool to explore further in the future.
Absolutely. The result is indeed impressive. The impact it has? Many times we are working on many variables, and you were talking about metabolism. Metabolic syndrome is something that continues to grow, affecting more and more people, and the approach sometimes does not take the microbiota into account. It can certainly be a nutritional approach, physical activity can be increased, and pharmacological support can be sought. In your opinion, would it be essential to incorporate the care of the microbiota into metabolic work?
I believe that nothing is essential, but if I have any common sense, I need to look for the measures that yield the best results. So I am looking for the maximum benefit versus effort ratio. Using a change in bacterial flora should be at the top of my list, because it has all the other benefits we were mentioning before. It's no longer just about wanting to lose weight by saying, well, I managed to lose weight because I changed my bacterial flora. I changed my gut bacteria and improved my mood, lowered my overall inflammatory profile, enhanced my immune system, and perhaps slowed down the rate at which I am aging. So, does it have many very positive effects due to this virtuous circle of changing bacterial flora that justify using bacterial flora as a tool? Generally speaking, I would say almost always, unless we have a bacterial flora problem to resolve, like SIBO, as we mentioned before. Moreover, it is very noteworthy that we always have to work on the bacterial flora in conjunction with the functioning of our digestive system. It makes no sense to repair a bacterial flora conflict. For example, there are bacteria that we know increase the risk of certain diseases, such as colon cancer. To repair those bacteria that, for example, feed on fermented proteins, or perform protein fermentation, I basically need to repair my protein digestion first. They go hand in hand to avoid nourishing those bacteria that I don't want to have in excess. So keep in mind that repairing the bacterial flora is also linked to repairing my digestive system, which often improves only when I change my diet, when I fix this diet and return to those ideas, to those levels of nutrition that we mentioned earlier. Improving that diet obviously impacts the amount of enzymes I have available, affects bile, and influences the quantity and pH I have in my stomach to properly digest proteins. But helping him understand what I need is always a positive behavior. For example, taking betaine with hydrochloric acid is a substance that somehow enhances protein digestion in the stomach and always reduces the symptoms of SIBO. It does not cure SIBO, it is not the solution for SIBO, but precisely because I am improving my protein digestion and enhancing my stomach pH, that pH helps prevent the excessive growth of bacteria later in the small intestine. So, 2021 always goes hand in hand with the digestive system and digestive system solutions per se, along with solutions from the bacterial flora per se.
Within this work on the digestive system and bacterial flora, attention is sometimes also given to foods that are advisable to consume, foods that are not advisable to consume, and then there is a series of foods that are often associated with allergies or intolerances and are linked to certain excessive responses from the immune system. It is probably something that depends a lot on each patient. There are many different tests, and sometimes one does not know very well where to go or what type of test could be done. Is there anything new? And knowing that it is complicated, is there any generic recommendation that could be given?
Well, there are certain difficulties regarding tests nowadays, especially food allergy tests, which is the next topic, which is our digestive system. It is a tube that is actually not inside our body. It passes through our body, but the food you consume is not inside your organism because it did not enter. It did not penetrate the intestinal mucosa, for example. And that is interesting because when I test for a food intolerance in the blood, for example, and I check if I am having an allergy, a food allergy test, which is classic in blood, the big problem we have is that the immune response to that food, let's say cucumber, for example, is not the same as finding a response to cucumber or tomato in the blood compared to the response actually occurring in the intestinal mucosa. Why? Because it is very likely that if these substances were to cross the intestinal mucosa poorly digested due to my permeability, my immune system would react against them, generating those symptoms that we associate with allergies or sensitivities, etc. Sensitivity is a term that is always very complex to define when we use it and when we do not use it. On the other hand, these foods are in a digestive tract, and what I need to do is repair the intestinal mucosa and prevent it from becoming impermeable in some way, thus blocking the access of these foods. It is essential to truly understand what the allergy or sensitivity I have to a food in the digestive mucosa is, which is the significant difference. It is not the same what happens in the blood as what happens in the mucosa, because in the blood I can capture many antibodies that are similar to a specific element. They are similar to the antibody that would capture that specific element and think that I need to eliminate it. And since I eliminated too much, I create nutritional deficiencies, when in reality what I can do is either rely on symptoms or base myself on my bacterial flora and understand that my bacterial flora will mutate, change and develop based on this balance. Because if I have a food that causes me harm and my immune system is generating inflammation, it obviously prevents bacterial development. So, on one hand, I can rely on my bacterial flora, and on the other hand, I can take these allergy tests, but I have to approach them with caution to really understand what is valuable and what is not regarding that information, or I can base it on my own symptoms, which is always the most difficult, but in a way, it is also the simplest and most accessible for most people. This involves following an elimination diet, where if I have one food and I have 10 suspects, I consume them one by one and understand which one caused symptoms. That is a very, very simple mechanism we can use to understand allergies. But there is something very interesting, Alfredo, which is that allergies are not eternal, except for some that are more genetically encoded, such as families that have celiac disease and pass it on to their children. Many cases are not genetic. So when I change my bacterial flora, when I change the functioning of my digestive system, many times that sensitivity or allergy decreases and disappears, and I can reintroduce that food. So we shouldn't stick to the idea. This is very interesting because we think of everything as if it were a photo. The information about my allergies is in a list, and I treat it as if it were valid forever. And the validity of that list is only for the period of time in which I made it. I have a tube that represents my time. This is a cut in that tube that is not representative of reality. If 10 years later I am still relying on that list, it is likely that I am very mistaken. So it is interesting to think of it as a constant process of trial and error, where I am basically refining my diet and eliminating the foods that I know I should not consume, which trigger an immune response or cause a more significant inflammatory response. There are foods that everyone knows will trigger that response, and there are foods that we are losing the ability to digest genetically. The typical example of this is the decrease of lactase, which is the enzyme that digests lactose from dairy products. Naturally, there are many ways to compensate for it. Obviously, consuming milk is not the same as consuming yogurt, where that sugar has already been used for the bacteria to develop. The same or something similar happens with gluten, where we find in many experiments on intestinal mucosal permeability that although not all of us are sensitive to gluten, the vast majority of us experience some degree of intestinal permeability after consuming it. The difference between a celiac and someone who has what is called, in quotes, gluten sensitivity compared to someone who does not is the speed of closure of that permeability afterwards.
Then, indeed, we have a lot of information on the table for all those who are listening to us. We have this procedure in 4 levels, in 4 steps, that can be immediately shared with a patient to improve the entire situation, their overall health through the care of the microbiota. We have talked about metabolic syndrome. We have talked about chronic inflammation. We have discussed mental and emotional aspects, stress management, and we have covered many things, of course, that can be included. Obviously, there is a need for training. We, at the Integrative Health School, offer training for professionals who want to deepen their knowledge. But doctor, if someone who is watching us now has had access to this information, has processed it, is aware and sure of the importance of the microbiota, will they start to establish some kind of advice for their patients? What would be the first step? What would be the thread that in your experience after so many years of clinical practice, research, and outreach, would be the ideal path to start introducing advice regarding the microbiota into your practice, regardless of the type?
I believe that the first step, without a doubt, is to learn to think in individualizing terms rather than in generic terms. It is convenient for all of us to think that the solution, I don't know, a level 1 understanding of bacteria, which unfortunately is still very widespread, is that there are good and bad bacteria, fermenting bacteria, and bacteria that cause putrefaction, and that those that cause putrefaction are always bad, and that the fermenting ones are always good. So these concepts that one sometimes uses to reach people who are not familiar with bacteria are valid, but they are valid, and I have to understand a little more if I want to solve it as a health specialist. I need to work with people and understand a slightly more complex level of individualization, realizing that what we often colloquially paint as bad is not always bad, and what we define as good is not always good. The typical case of this is SIBO, which turned everything upside down regarding what was previously done therapeutically concerning bacterial flora, because it was said that increasing bacteria, increasing fiber, etc. was beneficial. And if one has a patient with SIBO or has a patient with FODMAP, which for those who are not familiar is an intolerance to certain types of carbohydrates, it obviously greatly exacerbates the symptoms. So the solution is actually to understand things from an individualized perspective for each person, and to understand, based on that personal profile, what steps need to be taken. If we are going to approach it from a very generic term, it is a change in diet, first, related to a change in bacterial flora, whether I use supplements, or whether I use fermenting food, fermented foods, etc. With close collaboration, understanding what the underlying pathology is that is causing this imbalance of bacterial flora, along with a repair of these digestive mechanisms. And why do I say this? This point is very important for all health professionals. Why do I say this? Because I cannot fix a problem of bacterial flora, an imbalance of bacterial flora, by thinking that I will grow a bacterial group that is deficient and reduce a group that is overgrown, and nothing more. I have an underlying reason for why that happened, and if I don't remove that mechanism, I won't fix the problem. So, in my view, the first step is always to understand the underlying problem that leads to the imbalance of bacterial flora, which unfortunately is often associated with diet. And it's not just about food. While nutrition is important, of course, if I eat processed food every day, I will have a negative impact on my bacterial flora. But there are many factors impacting our diet today, as well as our digestive system and our bacterial flora, that are not just the foods we put in our mouths. For example, stress levels, sleep deprivation, and decreased exercise. All of these things disrupt the maintenance of bacterial flora.
Well, it is something huge. It is truly an exciting field. It is a new field. It is a field that is constantly changing, as the doctor tells us. And the only thing we can do is thank Dr. Sebastián La Rosa for being present whenever we ask him here, for sharing this knowledge and his time in a completely altruistic manner, and for helping us see new perspectives that will likely help us grow on all professional and personal levels.
Well, I'll leave you with a final message if you want, which is to understand in some way how this change in bacterial flora can completely change our quality of life. If you are an athlete, you can improve your performance by enhancing your bacterial flora. If you are a person who has digestive problems, it is essential to seek improvement in these digestive symptoms. If you are a person who is interested in being healthier, then you are someone who simply wants to improve your overall quality of life. Well, much of the premise suggests that improving the bacterial flora is likely to have very beneficial effects in the long term for maintaining quality of life for a longer period. It doesn't matter how long you live. What matters is to push the years you are sick to the limit of your life, living as much as possible without illness and without symptoms.
Well, what a magnificent message. For those of you who do not know Dr. La Rosa, please check out his YouTube channel, where you will find many tips like these for a healthy life and greater longevity. Thank you very much, Sebastián, for being with us, and thank you also to everyone who is watching us. Let us hope that together we can gradually apply some of these ideas and contribute to achieving a healthier and happier youth and society.